Crystal chandeliers bathed the long mahogany table in golden light. Silverware gleamed beside plates of untouched dessert. Mark's parents laughed loudly at another story about the company's latest record quarter. Mark rose from the head of the table. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick envelope, and slid it the full length of the table until it stopped in front of Elena. Laughter died instantly, every eye locked on her. Mark's voice carried across the silent room with practiced ease. "Elena, I've made my decision. This marriage is finished. Sophia understands my vision in ways you never could. Sign the papers tonight." Elena stared at the envelope for 2 full seconds. Then she reached for the silver pen beside her water glass. Her hand did not tremble as she opened the documents and turned to the final page. "I understand." She signed her name in one smooth motion. The scratch of the pen sounded louder than any word Mark had spoken. "Finally, we can stop pretending she ever belonged here. My lawyer will send the rest tomorrow. You can keep the apartment. I won't fight you over furniture. I hope she gives you everything you think you deserve." She placed the pen down, pushed her chair in, and walked out of the dining room. No one followed. The night air was cool against Elena's skin as she descended the stone steps. Behind her, the mansion windows still glowed with celebration. She did not look back. Her modest sedan waited at the end of the long driveway. She walked to it without hurry, heels clicking on the pavement. From her coat pocket, she drew a second phone, slim, black, and unknown to anyone in that house. She typed one line and sent it. Then she slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove down the winding road toward the city lights. In the rearview mirror, the mansion grew smaller until it disappeared. Elena's grip on the steering wheel loosened for the first time all evening. "Victoria." He served the papers at the table. "I signed. I'm coming to you now. I'll be at the office. Doors unlocked." The 32nd floor office overlooked the glittering downtown skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Reynolds Innovations Tower 3 blocks away, its logo still lit in blue. Victoria stood behind her desk, already pulling thick files from a locked drawer. Elena entered without knocking and closed the door behind her. Victoria did not ask how she felt. She simply placed one folder in front of Elena and opened it to the most recent share registry. Elena's eyes moved down the page. The Blind Trust still showed as the largest single shareholder. 52%. Anonymous. Untouchable. He filed this afternoon. He's asking the court to freeze every joint account and to declare you have 0 claim on the company. He believes it's all his. Let him believe it a little longer. The trust can call an emergency shareholder meeting whenever you want. One signature from you, and the board has to listen. Not yet. First, I need to see what he does when he thinks he's already won. The apartment was dark when Elena returned. Mark had not come home. She moved through the rooms she had shared with him for 6 years and turned on only the small lamp by the bedroom door. From the back of the walk-in closet, she pulled a battered wooden box. Inside lay old pitch decks, a faded photo of the two of them outside a tiny startup incubator, and a single brass key on a plain ring. She held the photo for a moment, then returned it to the box. She took only the key, placed it in her pocket, and zipped the suitcase she had already packed. On the kitchen counter, she left the apartment key and the signed divorce papers. Nothing else. You never asked where the first investment came from. You never wanted to know. She turned off the lamp and walked out, suitcase rolling behind her. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed the entire city spread below. No one except Victoria knew this address existed under a different name. Elena set her suitcase down and walked straight to the window. Far beneath her, the Reynolds Innovations building still glowed. She could see the corner office where Mark would be sitting right now, celebrating. On the marble counter sat a single sealed envelope she had left here weeks earlier. She opened it. Inside were the original trust documents and the first wire transfer receipt from 8 years ago. $500,000 sent anonymously to a struggling entrepreneur named Mark Reynolds. Elena folded the papers, placed them back in the envelope, and looked out at the city once more. Her reflection in the glass was calm again. You wanted everything to be yours. Soon it will be. She turned off the lights and stood in the dark, watching the building that carried his name. Pale morning light filled the penthouse. Elena sat at the marble counter in the same clothes from the night before. The coffee in front of her had stopped steaming an hour ago. Her personal phone, the one Mark knew, vibrated non-stop. She finally opened the latest notification. Business blog post. The photo showed Mark and Sophia standing in front of the Reynolds Innovations building, smiling for the camera. The headline read, "Mark Reynolds moves on. I built this company alone and I'm ready for what's next." In the article, he called the divorce amicable and said Elena had never truly believed in the vision. Elena closed the screen. She placed the phone face down on the marble and stared out at the city. 3 blocks away, the Reynolds Tower caught the morning sun. Elena chose a corner table at the back of the small coffee shop. A television mounted above the counter played a local business segment. Mark's face filled the screen as he spoke into a microphone outside his building. "Elena and I simply wanted different things," Mark said on the broadcast. "I need a partner who supports the long hours and the risks. Sophia does that. The company has always been my priority." Elena's phone rang. The name on the screen was Mark. She let it ring once more before answering, her voice low so no one nearby could hear. "What do you want, Mark?" "My lawyer sent extra documents this morning. Full release of any claims on the company or its assets. Sign them by tonight and this stays civil. Fight me, and I'll have to tell the court exactly how little you contributed to anything I built."
"I'll look at them."
"Good. Don't make this harder than it has to be. You have no leverage here." He ended the call. Elena set the phone down and watched the television as Mark's interview continued. The teller at the First National Bank branch smiled politely until she checked the screen. Her expression changed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. All joint accounts have been frozen by court order. There's also a hold on the credit cards linked to those accounts. You'll need to speak with the legal department." Elena nodded once. She did not argue. She simply thanked the teller and walked out of the bank into the bright midday sun. Her wallet now contained only the cash she had taken from the penthouse safe the night before. Across the street, a large digital billboard displayed the Reynolds Innovations logo. Below it, the tagline, "Built on vision, driven by one man." Victoria slid a fresh stack of court filings across her desk. Elena read the top page in silence. Mark was requesting an emergency injunction that would prevent her from accessing or claiming any interest in Reynolds Innovations. "He's also asking the court to order you to disclose every financial document you've ever touched," Victoria said. "He wants to prove you had zero involvement in the company's growth." Elena turned the page. At the bottom of the last document was a notice addressed to all interested shareholders and trust administrators. The trust that held 52% of the company had been copied on every filing. Victoria tapped the notice with one finger. "They received this too. Standard procedure. But it means the trust now has the right to review every move he makes from this point forward. Tell them to begin the review. Quietly. I want records of every decision he's made since the divorce papers were served." "Elena, if you activate the trust now, he'll know someone with real power is watching. Let him feel watched. He still doesn't know who's doing the watching." Elena stepped into the bright glass lobby of the Reynolds Innovations building. She wore a simple navy coat and kept her head slightly lowered. No one recognized her. At the reception desk, a young woman asked if she had an appointment. Elena shook her head and said she was just meeting a friend. She walked to the seating area and sat where she could see the glass elevators. Mark stepped out of one elevator with Sophia beside him. They were laughing. Mark checked his watch, kissed Sophia on the cheek, and walked toward the executive parking garage. Sophia stayed behind, speaking loudly into her phone about the boss's new chapter. Elena's secret phone vibrated once in her coat pocket. She glanced at the screen. A single line from the trust's managing attorney. "Unusual share activity flagged. Awaiting your instruction." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and stood up. No one stopped her as she walked out of the building. The city lights had come on below the penthouse windows. Elena stood at the glass with her secret phone in one hand and her old phone in the other. The old phone rang. Mark again. She answered on the second ring. "You haven't signed the new documents. My lawyer says you're stalling. If you think you can drag this out and claim any piece of my company, you're wrong. I built it. Every line of code, every client, every dollar. Sign by morning, or I go to the press with exactly how useless you were to this marriage and this business." "Do what you believe you must, Mark." She ended the call before he could reply. Elena set the old phone aside. She picked up the secret phone, opened a secure contact labeled only Trust Counsel, and typed one sentence. "Begin formal review of all recent corporate actions. Prepare notice of potential conflict of interest. Do not disclose the source." She hit send. Then she walked to the window and looked down at the glowing Reynolds Tower. For the first time since the family table, her shoulders relaxed. The small courtroom was nearly empty. Mark sat at the petitioner's table with his lawyer, looking relaxed. Elena sat in the back row, a simple black coat and reading glasses making her almost invisible among the few spectators. Mark's lawyer stood and argued that Elena had no financial stake in Reynolds Innovations and should be barred from making any claims. The judge nodded, ready to sign the temporary injunction. Then a third lawyer rose from the side bench. He was not on Mark's team. He addressed the court in a clear, formal voice. "Your Honor, I represent the interests of the company's largest shareholder group through a blind trust holding 52% of Reynolds Innovations. Any order that affects company governance or asset control must consider the trust's rights before it is granted." Mark's lawyer. "Who is this trust? We were not notified of any interested party." "The trust was notified of these proceedings as required. It has concerns about recent corporate actions taken without full shareholder review. We request the court to defer any injunction that could prejudice the company's majority ownership structure." "Motion for temporary injunction is taken under advisement. I want briefs from all interested parties by end of week." Mark slammed the office door behind him. Sophia stood by the window, already on her phone. He threw his jacket onto the leather couch and loosened his tie with sharp movements. He picked up the desk phone and dialed his father. While it rang, he stared at the framed photo of himself on the cover of a business magazine. "Self-made success." Richard Reynolds answered. Mark did not wait for pleasantries. "Some blind trust just walked into court and blocked the injunction. 52%. They're demanding to review every move I make. Who the hell controls that trust?" "Find out. Fast. If they can stop an injunction, they can stop a lot more. Do not sign anything until we know who we're dealing with. I built this company. No one is going to waltz in now and act like they own it." He hung up. Sophia stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "They're bluffing. You're the face. You're the founder. They can't touch you." "Then why do I suddenly feel like someone is watching everything I do?" Elena removed the reading glasses and placed them on Victoria's desk. Victoria poured 2 glasses of water and set one in front of her. "The trust's intervention worked," Victoria said. The judge pushed everything back. Mark's team looked blindsided, but now he knows someone with real power is paying attention. Elena nodded slowly. She opened her secret phone and showed Victoria the latest message from the Trust Council. "Shareholder review request formally acknowledged, awaiting further instruction on scope." Victoria studied her friend's face. "If we push harder, he'll start digging. The trust is still blind, but he has resources. Are you ready for him to come looking?" "Tell the trust to expand the review. I want every contract, every loan, every share issuance since the divorce papers were served. And I want it done within 72 hours. "That's aggressive. It will force his hand." "Good. Let him feel the ground shifting under his feet before he even knows who moved it." Crystal glasses and white tablecloths filled the private room at the Astoria. Mark sat at the head of the table with Sophia on his right and his parents on his left. The remains of dinner sat untouched. Margaret Reynolds set her wine glass down with a sharp click. A blind trust does not appear in court unless someone with money and lawyers is behind it. You need to find out who controls those shares and neutralize them. Richard nodded. Offer them a buyout or threaten litigation. Whoever they are, they clearly don't understand that you are the company. Mark stared at his untouched steak. For the first time all evening, he did not look confident. They stopped the injunction today without even showing their faces. What if they can do more than that? Then we fight harder. You built this. No anonymous trust is going to take it from you. Mark pulled his hand away gently and looked at the city lights visible through the tall windows. He did not answer. Elena stood at the penthouse window, the same position she had taken the night she signed the divorce papers. Below her, the Reynolds Tower was still lit, but fewer windows glowed now. Her secret phone rang. The Trust Council's name appeared. She answered without greeting. The review has begun. We already see several recent moves that look like attempts to shift value or dilute. Do you want us to issue a formal demand for explanation? Elena watched a single light go out in Mark's corner office far below. Yes, issue the demand. Copy Mark's personal attorney and the board. Make it clear the trust will not approve any further actions until the review is complete. Understood. This will escalate quickly. That's the point. She ended the call and placed the phone on the windowsill. For a long moment, she simply watched the city. Elena's sedan sat in a quiet corner of the underground garage beneath her building. She'd not gone upstairs yet. The engine was off. Only the dashboard lights glowed. She opened her old phone, the one Mark knew, and saw 3 missed calls from him and 1 text. We need to talk. Tonight. This trust nonsense stops now. Elena deleted the message without replying. She opened the secret phone instead and typed one final instruction to the trust. Prepare a list of every person who has ever asked about the trust's ownership in the last 5 years. I want to know who is starting to look. She sent it, then sat in the dark car for several minutes, listening to the quiet hum of the garage. When she finally started the engine, her expression had not changed, but something in the air had shifted. The television in the penthouse living room played a local business segment on mute. Mark's face filled the screen. He sat across from a host in a bright studio, smiling as he spoke about the future of Reynolds Innovations. Elena turned up the volume just in time to hear him say, "My ex-wife never really understood what it takes to build something from nothing. She wanted the security, but not the sacrifice. I did it alone. Every late night, every risk, every dollar. It was all me." The host nodded sympathetically. Mark continued. Some people try to rewrite history when things end, but the truth is simple. I built this company with my own 2 hands, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me now. Elena stood very still in the middle of the room. The remote slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. On the screen, Mark laughed at something the host said. She did not move to pick up the remote. 8 years earlier, the coffee shop had been small and crowded, with mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh espresso. Young Elena sat at a corner table with a laptop open, pretending to work on freelance consulting projects. Across from her sat a younger Mark Reynolds, 27, with messy hair and tired eyes. He had just pitched his startup idea to 3 investors who laughed him out of the room. Now he was telling her why he refused to give up. "I don't need someone to hand me money," young Mark said, stirring his cold coffee. "I need someone who believes I can turn an idea into something real. Most people only see the risk. I see the future." Elena watched him quietly. She already knew his idea had real potential. She also knew her family's foundation could fund it 10 times over without anyone noticing. But she said nothing about that. Young Elena, softly. Young Mark, smiling, hopeful. She nodded. She already knew which account the first wire would come from. An anonymous trust. No name attached. No trace back to her. The office was barely more than a rented room above a laundromat. One desk, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard covered in Mark's handwriting. It was past midnight. Only the desk lamp was on. Young Elena stood by the window while Mark paced, reading an email on his phone for the 10th time. The subject line was simple: anonymous investment confirmed, $500,000. Mark looked up at her, eyes bright with disbelief and gratitude. They said the investor wants to stay completely silent. No meetings, no credit, nothing. Just the money and belief in the vision. I don't even know who they are. Elena smiled, but it was small and careful. She had already decided she would never tell him the truth. She wanted him to love the woman who believed in him, not the heiress who could buy his dream outright. This changes everything. I can actually build it now. I can prove everyone wrong. Then prove it. And when you do, remember the people who stood beside you when no one else would. He pulled her into a kiss. She closed her eyes and let herself believe, for just a moment, that hiding her name and her fortune would be enough to keep this love real. Victoria's office lights were still on when Elena arrived. She had not called ahead. She simply walked in and sat down in the chair across from the desk without taking off her coat. Victoria took one look at her face and closed the laptop. She came around the desk and sat in the chair beside her instead of behind it. He went on television, Elena said quietly. He told the world I contributed nothing, that I wanted the lifestyle but not the work, that he built everything alone. Victoria reached for her hand. Elena did not pull away, but she did not squeeze back either. Her eyes stayed fixed on the dark window. I gave him the first $500,000 from a trust he still doesn't know exists. I introduced him to every early client through people who owed my family favors. I sat in the back of every pitch meeting and let him take the credit because I thought, if he loved me without the money, it would be real. Elena. He looked so happy on that screen, like he actually believes every word he said. Maybe he does. Maybe I made it too easy for him to forget who was really holding him up all those years. She finally looked at Victoria. Her eyes were dry, but something inside them had cracked. I think I'm tired of being invisible. The bedroom was dark except for the city lights coming through the open curtains. Elena sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the coat she had worn to Victoria's office. She had not turned on any lamps. On the nightstand lay the old wooden box she had taken from the apartment the night she signed the divorce papers. She opened it slowly. Inside were the faded photo of her and Mark outside the tiny startup incubator and the first anonymous wire receipt. She picked up the photo. In it, Mark was laughing, his arm around her shoulders. She was looking at him like he was the only person in the world. Elena traced the edge of the picture with one finger. The first tear fell onto the glass covering the photo. Then another. She did not wipe them away. For the first time since the family dinner table, Elena let herself cry. Quiet, shaking sobs that came from 8 years of silence and sacrifice. She had never allowed herself to mourn. She pressed the photo to her chest and bent forward. Shoulders trembling, the city lights blurred through her tears. And the crying finally slowed. She stayed curled for a long time, breathing in the dark. Then she sat up. She wiped her face with both hands, stood, and walked to the window. Her reflection looked back at her, eyes red, but steady. No more hiding. No more waiting for him to see me. It ends now. The diner was almost empty at 3 a.m. Elena sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she had not touched. Her secret phone lay on the table beside a small notepad. She had written only one sentence on the notepad. Full activation of trust rights. Prepare public disclosure and controlling interest exercise. She picked up the secret phone and called the trust council. The line rang once before it was answered. It's Elena. I've made my decision. Issue the formal demand for full transparency on all company decisions since the divorce filing. Then prepare the documents to exercise the trust's right to appoint new board members and remove the current CEO. Do it quietly for now, but make sure Mark's legal team receives everything by tomorrow afternoon. Understood. Once we send this, there is no going back. The company will know exactly who controls the majority stake. Good. It's time they knew. She ended the call, closed the notepad, and left the untouched coffee on the table. As she walked out into the night, her steps were no longer quiet. They were certain. Elena stood in front of the full-length mirror in the penthouse bedroom. She wore a tailored charcoal suit with a crisp white blouse and the single strand of pearls her grandmother had left her. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek knot. She looked like a woman who had never hidden anything. On the marble counter sat the secret phone. A message from the Trust Council confirmed everything had been delivered: the formal demand, the review findings, and the notice exercising the Trust's contractual right to acquire the founder's remaining equity. Elena picked up the phone one last time and typed a single line to Victoria. "I'm going in person. It ends today." She slipped the phone into her bag, checked her reflection once more, and walked out of the penthouse without looking back. The grand lobby of Reynolds Innovations bustled with employees heading toward the large conference hall on the 10th floor. A digital screen displayed today's event. Leadership update and company direction. All staff and investors welcome. Elena walked through the revolving doors at a steady pace. She did not wear a visitor badge. No one stopped her. She moved like someone who belonged. At the security desk, a young guard glanced up. For a second, his eyes narrowed, as if trying to place her face. Then he nodded politely and returned to his screen. Elena continued to the elevators. Inside the elevator, she stood alone. The floor numbers lit up one by one. When the doors opened on the 10th floor, she could already hear Mark's voice echoing from the open doors of the conference hall. The large hall was filled with employees, board members, and a small group of journalists seated in the back. Mark stood on the stage in front of a large screen showing the company logo. His parents sat in the front row. Sophia stood just off stage, watching him with a proud smile. Mark's voice carried through the room with forced confidence. "An anonymous trust is trying to bully its way into our company. They think they can threaten us with reviews and demands. But this company was built by one man with vision and grit. I will not let faceless investors steal what I created." Applause rose from parts of the room. Mark raised a hand for silence. "I built Reynolds Innovations from nothing. Every contract, every hire, every late night. It was me. And I'm here to tell you today that no one is taking it away." Paused for effect, smiling at the crowd. Then a voice from the side aisle cut through the room. "Actually, Mark, you didn't build it alone." Every head turned. Elena walked down the center aisle toward the stage. She did not rush. The room fell completely silent. Mark froze on stage. His smile vanished. Sophia stepped forward from the wings, eyes wide. Margaret Reynolds gripped the arm of her chair. Richard sat forward, suddenly pale. Elena reached the steps at the side of the stage. She did not climb them. Instead, she stopped at a microphone stand that had been placed for questions. She looked directly at Mark. "My name is Elena Voss," she said. "Through a blind trust established 8 years ago, I have held controlling interest in this company since the first dollar was invested. 52%. Every early round, every bridge loan, every quiet introduction that kept you alive. It came from that trust. My trust." She placed a single folder on the podium in front of her. "The review you received yesterday documented every attempt you made in the last 2 weeks to move assets, issue new shares, and dilute that interest. All of it without proper shareholder approval. The trust is now exercising its full rights." Mark's lawyer stood up in the front row, face red. "This is outrageous. You have no proof." "The proof is in the original wire transfers, the board minutes you never saw, and the contract signed under the trust's authority. But you don't need to take my word for it." She nodded to the trust's attorney, who had entered quietly from the side and now stood beside her with a second folder. "Pursuant to the shareholder agreement and the findings of the independent review, the trust hereby exercises its contractual right to acquire the founder's remaining equity at fair market value determined by the review. Effective immediately, Mark Reynolds is removed as Chief Executive Officer. The trust assumes full controlling interest and will appoint new leadership. Gasps rippled through the hall. Employees turned to each other in shock. Journalists began typing furiously. You can't do this. I built this company. Everything here is mine. You were nothing but a wife who signed papers and smiled. You contributed nothing. I contributed the money that kept the lights on when you had nothing. I contributed the belief when every real investor laughed you out of the room. I contributed 8 years of silence so you could feel like the man you wanted to be. And today, I'm done being invisible. She turned to the room. Her voice carried without effort. This company will continue under proper governance. Every employee who has worked hard here will be protected. The review also showed several recent decisions that benefited only one person. Those decisions are now under formal investigation. Mark Reynolds is no longer part of this company's future. Security appeared at the side of the stage. They did not touch Mark, but their presence made it clear he was no longer in charge. Dad, do something. This is my company. Richard Reynolds stared at his son for a long moment, then slowly shook his head. Margaret looked away. Elena stepped onto the stage. She did not look at Mark again. She walked to the center, picked up the microphone, and faced the crowd. I am now the controlling shareholder and executive chair. The trust has completed the purchase of the remaining equity. Everything Mark Reynolds built now belongs to the people who actually believed in it from the beginning. She set the microphone down. The room remained silent for 3 full seconds. Then the first employee began to clap. Others followed. The sound grew until it filled the entire hall. Mark stood frozen on the edge of the stage, face drained of color. Sophia had already stepped back into the wings. His parents were rising from their seats, preparing to leave without looking at him. Elena did not smile. She simply watched as the man who had divorced her at the family table realized he had lost everything he thought was his, in front of every person who mattered to him. The corner office that had once belonged to Mark Reynolds now belonged to Elena. The nameplate on the door had already been changed to E. Voss, Executive Chair. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Elena sat behind the large desk. She had not yet touched Mark's personal items. They sat in a cardboard box by the door, waiting to be collected. On the desk in front of her lay only 3 things: the original trust documents, a single pen, and the company seal. Victoria stood beside the desk with a tablet, quietly updating her on the first decisions already in motion. The board had been notified. Key executives were being briefed. The review of recent questionable contracts had begun. Elena signed the first document without hesitation. Then she looked up at Victoria. Tell everyone the company name stays Reynolds Innovations for now. The people who built it with their work deserve that much. But from this moment forward, every decision goes through proper governance. No more shortcuts, no more shadows. Understood. And the trust's acquisition of the remaining equity is complete. Mark Reynolds no longer holds any shares. Good, then it's finished. She placed the pen down and looked out at the city skyline. For the first time in 8 years, the view belonged to her openly. 3 blocks away, in a small hotel room that smelled of cheap carpet cleaner, Mark Reynolds sat on the edge of the bed. The television was on. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, Elena Voss assumes full control of Reynolds Innovations. Founder removed. Mark's phone lay on the nightstand. It had not rung once since the meeting ended. He'd called his father 3 times. No answer. He had called Sophia twice. She had sent 1 text. I can't do this anymore. Then nothing. On the screen, a reporter stood outside the Reynolds building. Sources close to the new leadership say the trust that now controls the company had been the silent partner from the very beginning. Mark Reynolds built the public face. The real capital and early support came from elsewhere. Mark picked up the remote and turned the television off. The room fell silent. He stared at his own reflection in the dark screen for a long time. Then he whispered to the empty room, voice hoarse, I thought I did it alone. He reached for his phone one last time, opened Elena's old contact, and typed a single message. "I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry." His thumb hovered over send. After a long moment, he deleted the message without sending it. He had already lost the right to say those words to her. On the quiet, private terrace of the Astoria, Elena and Victoria sat at a small table with 2 glasses of wine between them. The city lights had begun to come on below. No one else was on the terrace. Victoria raised her glass slightly. "To the woman who finally stopped waiting for someone else to see her worth." Elena touched her glass to Victoria's, but did not drink yet. She looked out at the skyline. The Reynolds Tower still stood, but the top floor lights were different now. Her lights. "I don't want revenge," Elena said quietly. "I just want the company to be what it could have been if I had never had to hide. And I want to live the rest of my life without pretending I'm smaller than I am." "You already started doing that today. Then let's make sure we finish it right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 women who had carried the same secret for 8 years. For the first time, neither of them needed to protect it anymore. Later that evening, Elena walked through the main atrium of the building. Most employees had gone home, but a small group remained. The ones who had stayed late to understand what the new leadership meant for them. When she passed, several people nodded respectfully. One older engineer who had been with the company since the beginning stepped forward. "Ms. Voss, thank you for what you said today. A lot of us have been here a long time. We just wanted to know someone was finally looking out for the work we do." Elena stopped and looked at him. She extended her hand. "I've been looking out for this company longer than most people know. From now on, I'll be doing it openly. You have my word." The engineer shook her hand firmly. Others nearby watched with quiet relief. Elena continued walking through the atrium. She did not need applause. The respect in their eyes was enough. The same small coffee shop from 8 years ago was still standing, though it had been renovated. The mismatched chairs were gone, replaced by clean wooden tables and warm lighting. Elena sat at the corner table where she had once met a struggling young entrepreneur. In front of her was a single cup of coffee, untouched. She had come here alone after leaving the building. No security, no assistance, just her. She looked around the room slowly. The counter where Mark had once nervously stirred cold coffee. The window where she had watched him walk away that first night, already planning how to send the money without him ever knowing her name. Elena took a small sip of the coffee. It tasted different now. She set the cup down and spoke softly to the empty chair across from her, as if the younger version of Mark were still sitting there. "You wanted to build something that was only yours. I gave you that chance. And when you threw me away, you finally gave me back to myself." She stood up, left a generous tip on the table, and walked out into the night. The city no longer felt like it belonged to someone else. Elena returned to the penthouse and stood at the same window where she had cried only nights earlier. The Reynolds Tower glowed in the distance, but it no longer carried the weight of her silence. Her secret phone lay on the counter. She picked it up, opened the contact labeled Trust Council, and typed one final message. "The review is complete. The company is stable. Thank you for your discretion all these years. You can close the blind trust. From now on, everything will be done in my name." She sent it. Then she opened the old wooden box one last time, took out the faded photo of her and Mark from the startup days, and placed it face down in the drawer. She did not need to look at it anymore. Elena turned off the lights and stood in the dark, looking out at the city she now helped shape openly. For the first time in 8 years, she did not feel the need to hide any part of who she was. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones we must stop protecting from the truth. And sometimes the greatest power we ever hold is the quiet decision to finally use it.